So just before we start, just want to acknowledge that we are with Wanyamarja people on Madjanji country here in Babinda. Down the road is the beautiful Babinda, the boulders. And just to acknowledge that this country it's a beautiful country, and we want to acknowledge that there's continuing connection between land, water and community, and wanting to pay respects to all our elders, yours and mine. We extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present and listening to our podcasts online. I've been blessed to grow up around the black politics in this country and have been a part of that really strong struggle. So it gives me great pleasure to be here. This is the second podcast in the National Treaty Alliance, Let's Talk Treaty. And I'm going to hand straight over to you, Barb.
Thank you, Sandra. I want to recognise the sovereignty of the people on whose land we all sit today and have this discussion. People have fought for land rights in this country since old James Cook arrived down here at Gamay, Botany Bay, just behind me. The frontier wars began. Our land laws are written in our rivers, our waterways, our oceans, our seas, our plants, our animals, the leaves on our trees. Our land laws are written all over, and we could read them. We can still read them. We know which country we belong to. People once again went to Uluru from all around the country, but most of the people who came with a good heart. They came to talk about what we could hope for and what we might achieve in the future. And they talked about being included in the Constitution. And they talked about truth-telling and to have a treaty. We are not minority people in this country. We are sovereign people in this country. And we maintain our sovereignty, doesn't matter what they say. The voice, surely, in the 21st century, we are sick of being advisors to this government. Totally reject it. I'm offended by it. We are not advisors. You can't put up one Murray person in a parliament to speak on behalf of every Murray person across this country. Wimpicha, Noongas. We maintain our sovereign lands individually, and we maintain our sovereignty as a nation. So the voice is just another trick. It's a trick. And a lot of money and effort is going into promote it as the answer. And a lot of people that I respect, a lot of non-Indigenous people, think that it's the answer. It's not. And we should reject it. Truth-telling has to be told. You can't have reconciliation, inclusion in the Constitution, or a voice in Parliament until you deal with the unfinished business in this country. We're not going to leap into this. We're going to say to the government, it's not time for that discussion. It's not time. We're not ready. So where was the power in the generations before us? It was in their dewey, their spirit, their soul, their knowing the truth and talking the truth. And that's what we have to create again. My message today to people is get active again. Don't be afraid to speak out. So if you hear people say, gee, they make you shame, stand up to them. Be bold, be proud. Think of the old people. Let them live inside your dewey, inside your spirit. And don't forget the sacrifices they made for you. I look around me and there's not many of my generation left today. They're all gone to the dream time. And I look at a lot of young people who are supposed to represent our interests. They don't represent our interests, they represent their own. They don't know the stories about country. They're not interested. So I just encourage everybody to think carefully about what a treaty might achieve and to stand with us. Yellow.
Thank you very much for that. I see the same things that you're seeing, and I think that it is time to take back the reins. I think it is time that we started mobilising again, because all will be lost.
My name's Josie Crawshaw, and I'm part of the Stolen Generation. It's always been a history of, it's never ever changed, the colonisation of this country, no matter what the words come out of any of the politicians' mouths, and it doesn't matter what political persuasion they are, it's all about taking this land. And make no mistake about that. You can call all the different programs that we have had since then, and even CDP was still a form of doing us justice on the cheap. I believe it's these issues that we should be taking this country to court on a huge class action just on that alone. Slave labour is still going on, and it renders us the most vulnerable, poverty-stricken people in the country. Clearly, I was born in an era when I wasn't even a citizen of my own country like most of us, in my age anyway. So I'm not talking history, I'm talking about my life story. So when people try to tell me, get over it, this is what has made who I am today, and to continue to be the activist and the advocate to fight for our rights, because I haven't really seen too much change. Right across this country, we have thousands and thousands of Aboriginal people that are so educated. But sadly, through that process, I think they've also been very assimilated. Right up to Howard in 1996, where we had 25 years where we had some form of self-determination. We were able to get many services in our community. We got the NT land rights. We ended up with organisations like ATSIC that were elected from the ground right through in all of the different regions of Australia. So we're not talking history again here. We're talking really in the last 15 years, 16 years. It started being called Stronger Futures. We've got Closing the Gap. All of these fancy, fluffy words that have still kept our people the most impoverished, with absolutely no voice, and processes and legislation that now remove our children at alarming rates in this country. If you thought Stolen Generation was bad, I saw a report yesterday that's just been tabled by Snake, our peak body in children's services in this country, Aboriginal childcare services. And at the moment, there is 22,297 children in Australia, Aboriginal children in care. I've always said there's been a war in this country, and genocide hasn't stopped. And genocide is still being what's practiced today by the removal of the children under the so-called neglect process, which they have made sure that Aboriginal people in the main have had to only, even if they work, only have a an unemployment benefit. At the moment, it's $40 a day. And yet they live in places that you pay $3 for fuel. You pay, you know, $18 for a roast chicken, $10 for a lettuce, and let's go on and on. And so that they've known this stuff and it's deliberate. So we have a catastrophe in this country and it's deliberate. They've had every report known to man for decades and decades on this. And yet no one in this country, and particularly the Aboriginal organisations that are in these spaces, like the legal services, like the health lot, that actually know what is going on, they have the data and the information, are silent. They are silent. Yes, they might write their reports into the government, but we've got to wonder, is the silence and the indifference to do with having their funds cut? And so they stay quiet. So where is this voice? Where is this voice in this country? Actually, just the whole process of the referendum council. That came about after decades of Senate standing committees, reports about Aboriginal people, the many statements that we've made, whether it's the Kirribilli statement, the Barunga statement, the Kalkaringi statement, the Eva Valley statement, the Irrikala Bark petition. It just goes on and on and on. And I think a lot of the confusion for Aboriginal people is, why do we have to have a referendum? Because the government has designed it. And it's what was called a referendum council, that we need to go to the people of the country to actually say, it's time for us to look at how do we have a relationship with the First Nations peoples? It's clear that they don't have any sort of voice. There is no standing. So they're sort of good intentions by some people as usual, though. Those intentions get written in such a way that it does lead you down a process that they want you to have a referendum. And now that's not entirely all the fault of the Aboriginal people that were part of that, were picked by the government to run that process. Jacinta Price is a really dangerous, dangerous person. She's now saying that there was no election process in the referendum council, but there was a referendum council process of elections. And there were 3 national meetings that they had a formula for having people to get to them. And they involved the wider community of 60% from the community and traditional owners, 20% of Aboriginal organisations, and 20% of people that really don't have a say and aren't in organisations. So they had those 3, they had 3 national meetings, they had 13 dialogues, and then that culminated in Uluru. And I was the co-convener of the Darwin Top End Regional Dialogue, along with John Christopherson. And all the way through that process and through my life, if I can just step back a bit, every action that I've done has always been about to act sovereign. So things like coming in and being detained on my passport, using my Aboriginal passport to say I'm sovereign and I would like the same rights as other people that come to this country and can have dual citizenship, and they don't have to forego their first country, their nationality, and where they belong. So a lot of my work, starting way back in the early 80s, was going to the United Nations, drafting the declaration, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These are universal documents and instruments that recognise that all peoples, with the S, have rights to be self-determining. And those processes just didn't happen overnight. We bring nation states to the table fighting for 30 years before they're willing to sign. So this isn't just this whole conversation that you get with so many people about having the voice. Oh, look, it's just little steps, the first steps. Like Barb, Flick, we've been doing this for at least 50, 60 years, and our parents before this, and our ancestors before this, everybody in this struggle. That is the most frustrating thing. We have fought and brought and dragged the world, nations, to actually recognise that colonised countries like ours have the right to have treaties, have the right to be self-determining, and have the power and the structures and the funding to actually do that. So that is one of the most disappointing things of this, is that we've had many of those processes, and you hardly ever hear any of the so-called leaders talk about the UN Declaration on the Rights of People. And Australia's been a signatory to these. But this is the first time for, over a decade or more that Aboriginal people were going to be able to have a conversation from around the country. And so we all jumped on board to say, let's see where this could go. One of the things, as we said, is always that there was that idea that there had to be a referendum. Now, we know that they are not successful. And the majority of people were arguing, well, at least the treaty, we don't have to have a referendum. We don't have to have one for truth-telling. And we still had the right under this, even though it was the referendum council, to actually say, no, we didn't really want to go down that road. However, we always felt that the push from inside the referendum council members that we should take as the main thing is to have the voice was always cart before the horse. We worried that we needed, while there were those that came out at the end of many of the, that 18-month process, that there were three main pillars. And truth-telling really probably was the biggest aspiration that people wanted. They wanted the country to know what has happened, not only for ourselves, but that this would then hopefully get into the whole education system and have Australia come on board like they did with the gay rights legislation and the right to marry. It was prime right, that those people voted in this country for that. And we felt that it was, or for some of us, we thought it was a missed opportunity to not put those pillars up first, and the treaty pillar that didn't have to rely on given that we were only 3% of the population and 97% of the non-Aboriginal population who has voting rights, a right to vote, were really deciding that for us. So it was always a huge risk. It was discussed ad nauseum. However, there was this idea, we need to get a hook in the door first, the little baby step again. the so-called little Trojan horse. But I think it's fair to say that we're just watching this 5 years on and how it's going, that this Trojan horse of the voice will keep the treaty and truth-telling in its bowels. It will never come out. It won't come out again if it is successful for 30, 40 years. They'll just stick with this process. That's one of my huge fears, because the Referendum Council Aboriginal members that mainly drove this realised, okay, we need to put some principles in around, some really guiding principles. If you're going to go with this voice idea as the one that was going to be really hard to win over through this referendum process, that at any point in time, if it was going to breach the 10 principles, the 10 principles were written on the back of the Uluru Statement, and it gave assurance, or it gave some assurance that people were able to say at any point that we think it is breaching our 10 principles and are going to erode those, we can press the button to stop. If any of the principles of reform could not diminish the Aboriginal sovereignty and Torres Strait Islands sovereignty, number one. And we don't know about being in the voice and being in the Constitution. They couldn't answer that. Does it cede our sovereignty by being part of that process? And it has now been 5 years since Uluru and the Uluru Statement. What I can say, and I've got all of the documents still from every regional council's dialogues, plus the Uluru stuff, that never, ever did any Aboriginal person that I know of the 1,200 certainly didn't ask as their main aspiration of a voice to be advisory. It's never that. In fact, that was fought all the way through. And yet that has become, and it came very, very quickly after. I think I saw it on the Sunday. I left Uluru on the Sunday, got home late Sunday night. On the Sunday morning, I saw the Weekend Australian. There were 2 articles, one by Noel Pearson, one by the White co-chair, Mark Liebler, on the same page on opposite sides, both describing that it would be, the outcome was an advisory voice, and that the government would have the powers to determine its functions, roles, its representation, and the powers. I was devastated. It then got repeated on Q&A on the Monday, so 3 days after. And so this is the new narrative. I haven't heard the answer yet, and I'd like to still know, with this process, does the fundamental question going into this constitution with this as an advisory voice cedes our sovereignty? Because that is not what the whole of Australia and Aboriginal people would ever want to see. That's been the one strength that we've got. The difference with the treaty, it is sort of a sovereign group against this nation state, Australia, actually negotiating a whole package, given we've never ceded sovereignty and there has not been any sort of arrangement with us, that we would be, treaties aren't the panacea, but they certainly have behind it, its main thing is to be self-determining and self-managing. And we want to be recompensed. We want a substantial package as part of that for us to lead our own organisations and institutions. What we do know in this country is we have right now, we have the highest incarceration rate in the world per population, and the Northern Territory hold that. We have the highest youth suicide on the planet per population. We have the most uneducated, unemployed. We have the highest unemployment. The ill health of our people is, the negligence is unbelievable. Our people are dying and they are sick. Our children wearing the brunt of this and being locked up and in a cycle now for up to their 40 or 50. An advisory voice doesn't cut it here. It's never cut it. We've only had advisory voices since Howard came in. He has smashed every other structure that we've had. And everybody else that's got any funding in there are being told, this is the service we're buying off you, and you don't have an advocacy role anymore. So none of our organisations, even whether it's well, they'd probably argue that Nacho has, as a peak body, some sort of right to advocate. However, that's just being ignored. So I believe that the only way is that we say, no, enough's enough. We're sovereign. To go on, we need to be at the negotiating table, and an advisory voice doesn't cut it. Probably one of the biggest wins we've had was the Mabo decision. That just laid out at the highest legal, the High Court of Australia, that we were the first peoples of this country. It wasn't terra nullius. And why would you back away from that and then go back to an advisory voice? That's, I think, the real missed opportunity to have the proper education to the non-Aboriginal people about this. I think my biggest fear is, yes, there is some goodwill, but with non-Aboriginal people, and the voice possibly may get up, who knows. However, this country is deeply, deeply racist, and it's been politicians for decades doing the whistleblowing, starting with Howard. He has allowed the non-Aboriginal community to actually be brave and start developing these very serious, extreme white views, because you can't have what we saw in Perth a couple of weeks ago, where that was a hate crime on a 15-year-old kid just going home, walking with his mates, going home on the path he goes from school every day to his place. So he wasn't in the wrong place, what he did every day. And in terms of wrong time, it was broad daylight. And these young men, that man that they've charged has got the courage to just get out and bludgeon him to death. And that is such an indictment on this country.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. You've hit home with some really hard truths, and I hope people will listen to this. So thank you very much.